gone too far. Go back. Right.
Yeah, we can see it, but I think you skipped to the second slide.
Yeah, it's fine, because the first one was only the introduction anyway. So welcome everybody, and good evening to you all. Like Nikki said, I'm Ben Keywood. Don't know me or haven't met me before, Nikki's already explained it very well what I do, but I love insects. I've had a passion for them since I was a small child, so I'm absolutely honoured to be asked to do this introduction tonight for Ross's presentation. So without any further ado, I'm going to start off with this slide here, which refers to a few years ago when I was asked to go on to Radio Sheffield to do a live show with a DJ about the State of Nature report. And the DJ asked me which particular group of wildlife showed the most concern from the report. And I said insects. And his response is the one that's there in bubble one. Why should I care about insects, he said. I probably killed thousands of them with my car just coming to work this morning. And obviously I replied to him with an answer which demonstrated the vital role that insects play in the ecosystem. But he wasn't satisfied, and he replied with, well, they're just those irritating things that either sting or bite or eat our food and our clothes, he added a final insult. So this is the kind of opinion that many people actually have of insects. And so it makes it very difficult to encourage people to afford the same interest in them as other groups of wildlife. And if we're honest, even though we're all probably, I would hope, not as dismissive of the insect kingdom as that DJ was, how many of us take the time to observe them or record them? If we see a yellow dung fly on a cowpat when we're out on a walk, or a leaf litter fly when we're out on a walk, do we give them the same attention as we would a sparrowhawk that flew across the path, or maybe a stoat that ran across the path? So they're questions that I think we can ask ourselves. Ooh, how do I move on?
Try your down arrow, Ben.
It seems to be jammed, it's not moving any further. Oh, here we go. But of course, insects are vital indicators of a healthy environment. So an abundance of insects is an indicator of a healthy river or a pond, or in a woodland, good numbers of insects show that the woodland has healthy soils, a good understory of ground flora and healthy trees. And likewise in grasslands, an abundance of pollinators demonstrates the richness of the flora. So I'm sure, like me, you're all looking forward to Ross's talk tonight, where he'll show us lots of examples of all these wonderful insects and their richness in the ecosystem. But there are plenty of insects, and if there are plenty of insects in an environment, then that means, of course, that there are good populations of birds as well that prey on the insects, and so they're an important part of the ecosystem. But our gardens in particular are very important habitats for insects. And this dock bug here, which I recorded last year, in March last year, was the first recorded sighting in Sheffield. But was it the first dock bug in Sheffield, or was it just the first one that had been recorded? Now, all of these incredible insects here have been sent in by our members who found them in their gardens. Now, the first one, the silver striped hawk, is a really rare hawk moth. And someone actually found that sat on their Christmas wreath on their door of their house at Christmas. And they sent this in saying they'd never seen a moth like this before. And of course, I surmised about how it got there. And I asked them if they bought this wreath from a garden centre, because I wondered if the pupa had been imported with the wreath. And they said, not very likely. The wreath was plastic, and it's been in my loft for 4 years. So we can only assume that this moth migrated and somehow just went in the reef for shelter. But it just shows what can turn up in your garden. The second beetle there is one of the Cardinal Beetles sent in by William Atherton, who sends a lot of insects to us. And this turned out to be quite rare for Sheffield as well, because it's got a black head. There's another species which is very similar, which is all red and has a red head. But this is Coccinea, which is the black-headed cardinal beetle. And this turned out to be quite scarce. And then on the final picture there, the blue carpenter bee. Now that is a Mediterranean species, and that was another one that William found in his garden. We can only assume that this species came in on imported timber because the caterpillar or the grub of it bores into wood. But it's mind-boggling how these things appear in Sheffield. And of course, all of these sightings are invaluable in increasing our understanding of the way insect populations are changing, moving, and responding to environmental conditions and climate change, something that Ross will no doubt be talking about this evening as well. Now, in 2016, Jeff Lambertson sent me this photo on the left there of a white letter hair streak butterfly that had landed on the dormer window of his loft. Now, this species forms colonies around single mature elm trees on which it's completely dependent to complete its life cycle. Now, from recording this butterfly, I was able to ascertain that there was an elm nearby because it needs the elm to survive. And then we've kind of forgot about it for 2 years. And then 2 years later, that butterfly record proved invaluable when that very same tree on that street was threatened with felling during Sheffield City Council and Amy's street tree programme. So we were able to go back to the tree because of that record, check to see if we could find any ova or eggs on the tree of that butterfly, which we did. So we proved it was actually breeding on that tree. And subsequently, all this led to the tree being saved and a mitigation plan to protect the butterfly. So that was all because of Jeff's record in 2016. If he hadn't sent that photo in of this butterfly to identify, we'd never have known about that colony. And that tree may have suffered a completely different fate. So the value of submitting records is really clear, especially for insects which tend to be under-recorded or overlooked. And our Data for Nature team here at Sheffield and Modern Wildlife Trust have created an easy way of submitting your sighting. This is the page that you get when you go on to wildsheffield.com/sightings. And we're interested in anything that you've seen, whether it be common or rare, on our nature reserves in Sheffield and Rotherham or elsewhere in your garden. It's quite easy to record it on here, and it accepts records of anything, not just insects, but any wildlife group at all. And it's going to help us build up a really good picture of what wildlife we have in Sheffield and Rotherham. So we'd really like to encourage you this evening, if you've not already submitted, if you've never thought about submitting a wildlife record before, to think about going on here and submitting some of your records. Now, when you go on the next page, you have two options. You have an option to enter a casual record or enter a list of records. So if it's a casual record, that's a one-off, like William Atherton could enter that carpenter bee, for example. Or if you've been on a walk or on a field trip, you can enter a list of species that you've seen on that walk on the same date. So you can click either of those to take you to the bit that's most appropriate. And if you're not sure what you've seen and you think, oh, I'm not really very confident about this, because obviously it's important that we get accuracy on here. But if you're not really sure, you can always email your unidentified wildlife to mail@wildsheffield.com, or you can post them on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, just like William and some of the other fantastic members and supporters have already done over the years. And we've just seen some of their photos there. Or you could try Google Lens if you're not sure. It's getting better. It's a bit more accurate than it used to be. And that's on your smartphone. And if you have a picture on your smartphone, there's an option at the bottom to try Lens. And if you click it, it finds the image and it identifies it for you. or at least it tries to. And sometimes it can be a good way, even if it's not completely accurate all the time, it may help narrow down the species and make it easier for you to identify it. But then on the next screen, you put the date in, you put your recorder name, and if you type part of the name, like say I'm trying to put a speckled wood butterfly in, I'd type speckled, or any part of the name. I could type wood if I wanted to, and it would come up with options. So all the options of everything are there, from fungi to micro moths, and you just select the one that you want. And then if you know what the sex is, if you know if it's male or female, you can put that in. If it's an adult, an egg, a caterpillar in the case of a speckled wood, you put that in. And then if someone else has identified it for you, you can put their name in there, and you can even add a photo. And then it comes up with a map, so you have to say where it is. So you can click that top button which says is a record sensitive if you think it's quite rare, you don't want it to be published widely. And then you put the location in. You can use the map to pinpoint it if you've got a grid reference, or you can search for the place using this bar on the left there. And you can put in the type of habitat that it is, say it's a woodland or improved grassland, but you don't have to put a comment in there, that can be left blank. And then any comments about its behavior or what it was doing, what it was feeding on, anything like that. And then you just click submit. And that is your record. And if you're doing a list of you've seen on a field trip, it's very similar. You just enter them one by one in a very similar way in a list form. So it's really simple. So we'd really encourage you to submit the records if you get a chance. Now, if you have a look at this this slide here, you can see some of the species that I've recorded in my own garden here. And so to conclude, what I want to point out is how easy it is to record, but also how it would be great if everyone could observe these things. The robin, for example, there, we could all, rather than just recording the robin, it's just as important to record what it's feeding on. So, you know, you could put the record in of its prey, for example. That's a good way of recording the invertebrates. And never think that just because something's common that my record isn't really valued. This green vein white, for example, that I photographed in my garden, this green vein white butterfly, which is the second picture there, the textbooks don't tell you that one of the food plants of that butterfly is Aubrietia. In my garden, it lays its eggs on Aubrietia. So that's an interesting record. And that might not be widely known that its caterpillar eats Aubrietia. So it's always worth mentioning, even what you think are common species. And of course, as you can see from those figures on the right there, we've got all of those records in our Nature Counts database, but it's very, very low compared to how many insects there are. It's the biggest order in the animal kingdom, and yet we've got comparatively few records for insects. And of those records that we do have, all the top 13 records are all butterflies, and they're the top 5 there on the top. They're the top 5 insect records we have. So don't dismiss those beetles or those stilt-legged flies or whatever else that comes into your garden. That fly on the right there, that weird-looking fly, that just flew in through my lighted window. So you don't have to even have a garden. You know, you can attract insects onto your lighted window in the evening. So record them. Why not record what you see and send it to our Nature Counts, put it on our Nature Counts website on the database. We'd really appreciate it, all the records that you could submit. So to conclude, I've just got to put this last slide to show the amazing diversity, or partly show the amazing diversity of the insect kingdom and how fascinating it is. And I'm really looking forward to Ross's talk tonight, where I'm sure we're going to learn a lot more about the insect world. And just to remind you that you can watch Simon's Nature Natters, which he did a few weeks ago on YouTube, about wildlife recording, which gives you some more pointers and tips about the benefits of recording wildlife. Our Action for Insects campaign is still ongoing, and that's the link for it there on the left-hand side. And also on YouTube, there are some fantastic BioBlitz videos that our colleague Paul Richards did a few years ago, which show the benefits of recording wildlife in your own garden. And he shows you where to look for various invertebrates and what you might find. They're really entertaining videos. So if you get a chance, have a look at the BioBlitz videos as well on YouTube. So that's it from me. I hope that's inspired you a little bit to start noticing more insects on walks and maybe even record them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. That's brilliant. And those BioBlitz videos that you mentioned are actually on the sightings page because I've just seen them there. So if you go to that link, which I've just put on the chat, you'll see the videos there. That's a great introduction. Thank you. We'd like to encourage people to get involved and not just listen to what people have got to say, but to try and take action themselves in some way where possible. Now we're on to a main talk tonight from Dr. Ross Piper. So I invited Ross to provide this wild night in for us today as we study for our PhDs in the same department at Leeds University at the same time in the early 2000s. I have to confess, I can't remember exactly what he was studying, as I remember him more for being a reliable presence at the parties. But I do remember that he was studying invertebrates. I was studying bats at the time. So Ross is a zoologist, entomologist, and an ecologist who undertakes research, writing, and broadcasting. Like Ben, he is a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society, and he's been lucky enough to visit some fascinating places, to have even discovered new species and even a genus of invertebrate himself. You may have seen him on television in programs such as Wild Burma, Nature's Lost Kingdom, and he also provides expert consultancy for broadcasting behind the scenes. He teaches, although he's just told me he didn't enjoy homeschooling, but he's given talks in several countries. He's published numerous articles, news features, scientific publications, 14 books for different age groups, including the book Animal Earth. And the one I liked the look of was was called Blood, Poop and Dead Skin. You have to send me one of those, that one, Ross. And he has a new book out today called How to Read an Insect, which looks beautiful. I'm sure it's fascinating. His books feature many of his own macro photography images, and I'm sure he'll share some of those with us today in his talk, which is called Insects, Their Incredible Diversity and Fascinating Lives. So over to you. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks very much, Nikki. I'm just going to share my screen so I can go through my talk I've prepared. Thanks so much, Ben, for that talk as well. Very interesting. So building on some of the things, thank you to everyone, by the way, for joining tonight, spending some of your evening with us. So as Nikki said, I'm an entomologist, and my main interest really is the way that insects live. So rather than just thinking about, where you find things, it's also thinking about what they do. Because if you find out a little bit about the way the insects lives, you'll be absolutely bamboozled, because although these animals are very small normally, their lives are actually very complicated. So I'll just give you a little bit of background first to insects. So they've been around for a really long time. They've been around, they diverged from crustaceans. They're effectively terrestrial crustaceans, and they diverged from the rest of the crustaceans probably about 500 million years ago. They were the first animals to take to the air, so that was around 400 million years ago. And most of the groups that we see around us today, they were established about 350 million years ago. So this is an ancient group of animals, and they were really the pioneers of life on land in terms of conquering all the niches and all the different ways you can make a living on land. So that's what makes them so extraordinary. You can see at the bottom there, there's a picture of a fossil, one of the oldest complete fossil of an insect. That one is around, about 380 million years old. There are older fossils, but they're only fragments. The oldest one is just the mouth parts of a particular insect that lived about 400 million years ago. So it's a group of animals with a very long and interesting heritage. And as Ben pointed out earlier in his short talk, there are loads of them. So far we've described around just over 1 million species of insects. There are millions more out there. To describe. And what's really interesting, what really interests me is the fact that even of the described ones, so the ones that we've put a name to, we know so little about the ways they live. And so the ins and outs of their lives are mostly unknown. We know, obviously, the big conspicuous insects, we know more about them. So say things like butterflies and say things like dragonflies and the insects that spread diseases or feed on our crops. But they account for just a tiny, tiny sliver of insect diversity. And you can see some of the numbers here with these figures here for the most speciose groups, so the biggest groups of insects. So beetles, which are the biggest at the moment, getting on for 400,000 species. The butterflies and moths, around 180,000 species. Most of those, by the way, are butterflies. Moths. Moths are much more diverse than butterflies. Then the wasps, ants, and bees are around 150,000 species. And I think if you could fast forward like maybe a few decades, a few centuries, I think it would turn out actually the wasps and probably the flies are probably the biggest groups, probably more speciose than the beetles. It's just that fewer people study those. Beetles have always been a favoured group amongst collectors. You know, people like Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, and lots of Victorian collectors started off primarily as beetle collectors. And then something that I always think about. So there's all these insects around, but for most people, even people with an interest in nature, if you ask them, you know, what are insects for and what do they do? For most people, insects, their normal stock answer is, well, insects, you know, they're food for bigger animals. And that's right, they are, you know, they're part of the food chain, they're part of food webs. But the thing is that completely glosses over, that view completely glosses over the extraordinary richness and diversity in their lives. But because they're so small, we tend to overlook that. We think, oh, it's like a tiny animal, like it can't be very interesting. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you find out that these things have extraordinarily complex lives. And we overlook them because they're genuinely tiny. They're some of the smallest animals. This picture here shows a thing called a fairy wasp. I found this in my garden. This is about 0.8 millimeters long, but they get much smaller than this. The smallest ones known are around 0.14 millimeters long. And that makes them among the smallest animals, so smaller than some single-celled organisms. But they've managed to pack a huge amount of complexity into these tiny packages via miniaturization. So their cells have like shrunk down to like tiny, tiny proportions to pack lots of cells into a tiny, tiny space. So, for example, if you look at the head of this wasp here, its brain is composed of maybe around 5,000, 6,000 cells. You contrast that with a honeybee, which has around 850,000 brain cells. You know, this thing has a tiny brain, but even with that tiny brain composed of relatively few cells, it's able to do really complex things. It's able to go and find its host. This is a parasitoid of the eggs of other insects. It's able to go and find its hosts. It's able to go and find mates. It's able to fly. It's able to navigate. It's able to do all these things, but in a tiny, tiny package. And just how they do that is not really well understood. And it's an area of intense research at the moment because people are hoping that if we can understand how the brains of these animals work, it will inspire new types of artificial intelligence, maybe on autonomous drones and things like that. So there's an awful lot of interest in the way that specifically the nervous systems of these things work because they're so tiny. You can see that same species, so that species of fairy wasp there, you can see it next to a 1p coin. That gives you an idea of how tiny it is. And this is another one that I found yesterday. It's in this tube here, actually, which I've got on my desk. It's a tiny, tiny scalionid wasp, so another parasitoid, another egg parasitoid. And again, this one's tiny. You can see it there for scale. You can see it next to the tip of a mechanical pencil. So that's a 0.5 millimeter tip of a mechanical pencil. So you can see how tiny some of these things are. And again, we mustn't assume just because these things are tiny is that they're not interesting. These things have really complex lives. Every insect does. And so the purpose of this talk today really is to look at some of these extraordinary examples of how insects live. And that's really the subject of Nikki mentioned my book. This is a shameless plug of my book. But this is really about an intro really to the ways in which insects live. Because for me, that doesn't get enough attention. Often there's a lot of interest in like trying to figure out, what lives where, but I think we should also try and watch and learn from these things. And just, if you spend a little time out in your garden or any green space around you, just watching these things and watch what they do, you'll never fail to be impressed by them. They're just incredible things. So let's start from the beginning. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of some of the extraordinary ways in which insects reproduce. And one thing that you've probably seen, all of you have probably seen, small white butterflies. These are very common butterflies all through the UK. And what a lot of insects do for the purposes of mating is the male needs to produce something that's a bit of an incentive for the female to make her want to mate. And often this is a thing called a spermatophore. So this is a special little capsule that contains the sperm of the male, but it's also nutritious. It's got a nutritious coating that the female can use to develop and mature her eggs. Now, in the small white butterfly, this thing's enormous. On the left here, you can see the spermatophore produced by the male. The white blob here is the sperm contained within that. And that can be almost 13 to 15% of the male's body mass. So he produces this enormous thing while they're mating. So this whole elaborate structure is produced inside the female while they're mating. The female, to be able to deal with this, she's actually got this jaw-like structure inside her genital tract that chews through this spermatophore, and her genital tract also acts almost stomach, so it can digest as well. So she's not only got her normal gut, she's also got this other gut in her reproductive tract, which is just incredible. And a lot of insects do this. A lot of insects, the males will produce this complex spermatophore, which the females use, and it's often the incentive that gets the female to mate. Another thing that that male insects will also do to incentivize mating is that they will give the female some defensive toxins that the female will use as protection from her enemies. So these are beetles called oil beetles. If you ever have a chance to go more on the west coast of Britain, but you can see them all over in the late part of the spring and the early summer. You might see these wandering around on coastal paths or on heaths. These are fantastic insects. And during mating, the male passes a defensive chemical, a real nasty toxin actually, called cantharidin into the female, and that spreads through the female's body, and she uses that as protection from her enemies. So that's another way the males get the females to mate with them, by giving them some sort of present. Otherwise, the females just aren't interested. There has to be a reward. And then what you also have, so the female can see the quality of the mate, and also to the right species. You often have these ornate appendages or some sort of decoration. Now, in these wasps, all of these 3 species you can find in the UK. The one on the right here is quite rare, but the one on the left can be quite common. This genus is called crabro. And the males all have these really elaborate tibial shields. Can you see these? And they've all got very distinctive patterns that are specific to that particular species. The one on the right here, Crabro scutulatus, looks a bit like a sort of zebra stripe. Now, when these animals are mating, the male holds these tibial shields over the female's eyes, and no one is really sure what's going on here, but it's thought that these tibial shields, because of the distinct pattern on each one, they allow the female to detect that he's the right species. Because sometimes you can get a male trying to mate with the wrong species, and obviously that's no good for anyone. So these tibial shields and the patterns they're on, they give the female a good idea if he's the right species. And also, if they're a nice shape and whatever, and the pattern's right, then it probably gives some indication of if he's a good quality mate or not. And then you also have a similar thing in lots of flies too. You see these ornamentations and all these elaborate things in all sorts of insects. But what happens is some insects is that the roles have been reversed. It's often, normally it's the male that has these elaborate things and these, female. But in some insects, female, damp flies. And what happens here is the female has these really feathery legs, these bristly legs. And when she's in flight, she can flatten her abdomen right out like this. And it's the females with these big, that can make their abdomens look as big as possible by also putting their legs to the borders here to make their abdomens look as big and wide as possible, makes them really enticing and captivating to the males. because it's the males that are the picky ones in these flies. So by the females having these traits, having these broad abdomens and these feathery legs, they can get the best quality males. And you also see some really odd sexual role reversal in some weird animals, weird insects that live in caves. So these are cave bark lice. And what's happened here is that the male and female have switched position, really. So the female is the one that mates with the male. So the female has a false penis that she can insert into the male. And it's thought that this has evolved because they live in a habitat where there's so little food. The males can produce one of these complex, nutritious spermatophores, and the females want to try and get hold of that because there's so little food in the caves. So they've switched positions as good as really. They've switched roles. So the female acts like a male, and the male acts like a female. And again, these are just a few examples amongst million described species of insects. Any particular species of insect you look at, if you look closely at the way they reproduce, you'll find some really remarkable things. And then what can also happen with mating amongst insects is that you can often have spoiling tactics. So a male will find a couple mating, and he'll want to say, no, actually, I want to go. And so he'll go along and he'll try and pull this is what's happening here in these leaf beetles. This male is trying to get this other male off the female. And sometimes you can have a whole line of them sort of lined up, or trying to compete to mate with the female, or trying to pull each other off and mate. There's just enormous complexity to all these things. But yeah, because they're small, often we just don't look. We're just not tuned in to sort of really sort of look and notice these things. And it's all about, patience and observation, really. So then once we've gone through the rigors of mating and all the complexities thereof, the females of various insects, lots of insects, do some incredible things. Wait 1 minute, I'm just going to let the cat out. Sorry about that. The cat was scratching at my door. Okay. Yeah, so the females of many insects, they go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that their young, their offspring, have the very best chance in life. And to me, the best example of this, the one that's been probably the most studied, is the bee wolf. So this is an insect that used to be really rare in the UK, but it's spreading rapidly with climate change. It's been recorded as far north as southern Scotland now. You can find it maybe on the coast in Yorkshire. They prefer sandy habitats where they can make their elaborate underground burrows. So these things are specialist predators of honeybees. So the female bee wolf, after she's mated, her sole job is to go and catch as many honeybees as possible. When she finds a honeybee, she wrestles it to the ground, stings it with her sting, and she injects a paralyzing venom. Now, the venom of this stuff is really interesting. It's not about causing pain like the social wasps that we see sometimes around their picnics or around their beer in a beer garden. The venom of these wasps is much more complicated. It's about paralyzing. It causes an irreversible paralysis of the honeybee. So the honeybee is still alive, and it needs to be. It's very important. It stays alive. It can't die, but it can't race through its stores of sugar and fats in its body too quickly. So the venom can also tamper down the metabolism of the prey. So the female catches honeybees and she stocks them in an underground nest. So she excavates this as she's going along. It can be quite an elaborate structure. If you have a look online when you have a chance after this talk, have a look online at some bee wolf nest casts, they're called, and you can see the complexity of the inside of the nest. So imagine like a tunnel that goes off in different directions, and at intervals along the tunnel, you will have one of these brood chambers. Now, each of these brood chambers is stocked with between 1 and 3 honeybees. So you can see the paralyzed honeybees in one brood chamber here, 2 honeybees here. This long sausage-shaped thing is the egg of the bee wolf. Okay, so this bee wolf is a solitary hunting wasp, and it's caught these honeybees, and it's provisioned the brood chamber with these honeybees. What it does next is pretty complicated, is that it can't afford for these honeybees to go moldy once they're in the brood chamber, and there's a very good chance of that happening. So what happens is the female licks it all over with some secretions from these big glands in her head. And it was thought that maybe, you know, these secretions maybe inhibit the growth of bacteria and fungi, but it's actually more interesting than that. What happens is the female effectively embalms the honeybees. And so there's the secretions from these glands, they cover any imperfections or any little cavities in the surface of the honeybee. So there's nowhere for water, so there's nowhere where water can condense on, so you don't get any condensation. And if there's no condensation on the honeybee, bacteria and fungi have a much harder time of getting a foothold on there and destroying the prey. So the female's done that. She's licked the prey all over to embalm it. The egg has been laid. Before she leaves that brood chamber, because she's going to seal that brood chamber up before she leaves. And before she does that, this is the next thing in the story that's really amazing. All of this, by the way, was found out by a group of researchers in Germany who have published all these amazing things just on the one, just on the ecology of this, so on the lifestyle of this particular insect. And their only question was that started all this research off was, what does this thing do underground? You know, we can see it catching its prey, honeybees, but what is going on underground? And they figured out that this way of keeping these things in captivity and watching what was going on underground. And you can read a bit about this after, but it's incredible. Over the period of 10 years, they published loads and loads of really interesting stuff. And so the next thing they did, the next thing the honeybee, the bee wolf does, sorry, is that before it seals that brood chamber up, it coats, it leaves a little daubing. Can you see this white secretion here that's coming from between the antennal segments of the female bee wolf? These are actually a symbiotic bacteria that are cultured inside special cavities inside the antennae of the bee wolf. Now she leaves a little like daubing of this paste, this bacterial paste on the inner wall of the brood chamber, seals it up, and she leaves, and she'll never have anything to do with that brood chamber again. She'll never see her offspring, okay? Because these things only live for one season. Once they finish their nest, that's it, they die. And then after that, the egg hatches, the bee wolf egg hatches, the larvae here on the left grows, feeds on really quickly, actually, in about the space of a week. It completes its development, starts spinning a cocoon. And as it starts spinning that cocoon, it takes in some of that white bacterial paste the female left for it and incorporates that into the cocoon it's making here from silk. And it turns out that this symbiotic bacteria, which is called Streptomyces phyllanthii, that actually produces a load of antibiotics that kill pathogenic bacteria and fungi. So the larvae, fully developed, anoints itself with this special protective bacterial paste to protect itself from its own enemies, because it has to stay underground until the next summer. So it will pupate, and the adult will then maybe emerge, maybe very early part of spring, and then it will be underground until the late summer, so maybe June, July. So in that whole period while it's underground, it needs to be protected from potential pathogens. And that just gives you an idea of, you know, the lengths that some of these things go to. If you ever see a bee wolf colony, it's just a fantastic to watch. It's really fascinating. There's just this incessant activity. So you've got these female bee wolves that are flying to and fro, going to catch prey, bringing the prey back to the nest. It's just incredible the lengths they go to. And this is just one example. So far, we've described around 20,000 solitary wasp species around the world. And this is one of the few species that has been studied in any detail. So you think of all of the stuff that's out there still to be studied. You know, it would take literally an army of scientists, thousands of years to work out exactly how all these different things are living. There's just so much to work out. You know, just putting a name to a species, you know, that's just really the thin end of the wedge. Once you've done that, trying to figure out exactly how these things live, what they do, and how they interact with the species, that would take, you know, literally, centuries, thousands of years to figure all that stuff out, because there's so many species and there's so many interactions out there. And then another one, a really good example. This is something we won't find in the UK, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint. This is a type of dung beetle. Now, as the name suggests, dung beetles normally feed on dung, but this one is a specialist predator of leafcutter ants, so new leafcutter ant queens. So it finds the leafcutter ant queens just before about to try and establish a nest. And normally, dung beetles will go and collect dung from like dung of a big ungulate, say a cow or a horse, whatever else, and they'll provision that in brood chambers, a bit like the bee wolf. But this one has completely shifted So it's become a predator of other insects. So it seeks out these new leafcut rank queens, cuts their head off with the sharpened part of its clypeus here, and then it provisions an underground nest with the body of the leafcut rank queen. These are small pictures. These are experiments that were set up in Brazil with one of these beetles decapitating the leafcut ant and then taking its body down below. But it just gives you, for me, these examples like this, it's given me, I'm always absolutely bamboozled by it, because it just gives you an indication of, how complex the lives of these things are. This thing has to be able to find, this very specific prey, and then it needs to know what it knows, because it's all innate. Yeah, it knows to stock a complex burrow with it, and then the larvae feed on that provision prey. And if that isn't amazing, like imagine if, one of these animals was, like 50, 60 kilos, something that we can't help noticing. These things are very small, but it doesn't make their lives any less dramatic or any less fascinating. And that's what you almost always remember with these small animals, that although they're easy to overlook, there's all this incredible stuff going on. But on the whole, no one really knows much about it. There's a few examples that have been well studied, but that's about it. And then, some female insects go to other extraordinary lengths. So this is the genus of beetles that I spent a lot of time studying while I was doing my PhD. This is a genus of beetles they're commonly called pot beetles. And this is because what happens is the female, as she's laying an egg, she coats it in these little delicate plates of feces to make what eventually forms almost like a little fur comb. So you can see it here. And it takes the female probably maybe 15, 20 minutes to do one of these, and she will maybe produce 100 eggs in her lifetime. So it really goes to show, the lengths that some of these things go to. And once the eggs hatch from this specialized egg case, the female, when she's finished the egg case, she flicks it off and it ends up in the leaf litter. It hatches, and then the tiny larvae, when it hatches, it carries the egg case around with it and adds to it itself using its own feces, till eventually you have this structure formed, this little pot, this little flask-like structure. And this gives these beetles their common, they're sometimes called pot beetles, because of this larval structure. And so the female, the mother, gives them a helping hand in doing that by starting them off with this egg case, which is distinctive for every particular species you look at. Again, this is a genus of beetles. Have 19 species in this genus in the UK. And if you go to some nice quality habitat, some nice quality, maybe calcareous grassland, you can see this species and some related species. So yeah, I mean, there's just so many examples like this of, these really complex lives that are, just down in miniature. And so once these animals, have reproduced, the females have given their offspring, a bit of a head start in life by provisioning burrows or, encasing eggs in different cases or whatever else. You have these life cycles. And our idea of a life cycle of an insect is a bit ingrained with, the idea of a butterfly. So it goes from egg through a caterpillar into a pupa into an adult. That's the simple way. And we see that a lot, but there are also some really extraordinary diversions from that, where you have really complex life cycles. This is one example here, where you have, this is a beetle. The common name is the telephone pole beetle. Again, it's something we don't have in the UK, but we do have other animals that have similarly complex life cycles. And so the normal run-of-the-mill life cycle for these things are female larvae that are asexual, so they'll never have sex, but they can produce clones of themselves. So that will go on, that will keep going on for, for as long as it needs to. Then now and again, what happens is that, and it can be due to temperature changes, one of the larvae can produce a male larva. The male larva, when it starts to develop, it feeds on its mother, the female, by crawling inside her and eating her from the inside out, which is a bit grim. And sometimes the males are really rare in these animals, by the way. This diagram on the left gives you an idea of the complexity of this life cycle. Normally, we imagine these life cycles just to be a nice, neat circle, There are so many more things going on here. And another example of that, something closer to home that you might be able to see if you really, are these animals here. These are really weird insects called Strep Citrons, and these live in the abdomens of different insects, often things like solitary bees. If you go out looking for solitary bees in the early part of the year, especially a few of the species like Andrena scotica and some of the Andrena species. If you look at the abdomen closely, you might see one of these things. I flipped this abdomen around because it looks a bit like a sort of sad face. This is the actual the front end of the female parasite that pokes out of the host. The rest of her body takes up on the right there. You can see it takes up nearly the entire abdominal cavity. So this thing is being nourished by the host the whole time it's alive. And the male parasite will never leave its host. It relies on the male, which is the thing in the really weird insect there with wings at the bottom. It relies on this male being able to find one of these females while it's still in the host. And these males have incredibly short lifespans. They might live only maybe an hour, 2 hours. And in that time, they've got to find a mate to make more copies of themselves to continue these extraordinary life cycles. And so to do that, they've got these really big elaborate antennae, really interesting eyes too. Often, most of them don't make it, but a few of the lucky ones will find a mate in the host and continue these extraordinary life cycles. So if you have a chance, look out for these things. These are quite small again, but again, don't let scale and small things put you off from having a close look at these things. One of my favorite insects of all, I think, that I started my first slide with are parasitoids, parasitoids of other insects. So these egg parasitoids in particular are really interesting. These are tiny things. These are only normally a fraction of a millimeter long, and they have to find the eggs of other insects in which to lay eggs. And again, you could go out into any habitat here in the UK with a sweep net, and you could sweep through vegetation from a minute or two, and you'd find hundreds of these sorts of things that live in these sorts of lives in plain sight, hidden but in plain sight. What makes these really interesting is that because their bodies are so small, how can such a small body produce enough eggs to make it sort of worthwhile to keep ticking over? They've evolved this really remarkable adaptation where one egg can become thousands. So what happens is the egg is laid at the top right here. This is a bit of an academic slide, so excuse this one, but there's no decent photographs of it. There's only sort of black and white images. But what happens is the egg divides again and again and again to produce this big complex mass of cells that then divides to produce the embryos that will go on to produce larvae. And these are all going to be clones of each other. But that's not it, because what happens is some of those clones can become specialized. Remember, all of this is going on at fraction of a millimeter scales. The adult insect is maybe a 0.5 millimeters long. So all these larvae are absolutely minuscule. The larvae, what happens? The larvae inside the host, some of them can differentiate and become soldiers. So they'll wander through the body of the host looking for other parasitoids that have already laid their eggs inside that host, and they'll destroy those. But those soldiers will never go on to become adult wasps. Only the normal larvae that are shown here. This is a soldier larva here. This is a normal larva. This will go on to pupate and go on to produce more wasps. And so they've got this incredible division of labor in this one species, in this one tiny host egg, And again, as I said, these things are extraordinarily common. You could go anywhere, any habitat, and find these. But being able to appreciate, some of their lifestyle, I think, really helps us sort of engage with them and think more about, just how amazing these animals are. And then, so these animals, as part of their life cycles, they have to try to avoid getting eaten. Getting eaten is obviously a massive challenge for all insects because they're so small. Lots of things want to eat them, and so they're often equipped with some really remarkable defenses. This one is one of my favorite ones, I think. This is a type of jewel wasp again. In this country, we've got about 30 odd species of jewel wasp. If you're at this time of year in nice, warm, sunny conditions, and you look closely at different habitats, maybe like a warm, sunny bank, in like a sandy habitat, or maybe even just a bare stone wall, I can guarantee that you'll see some of these within a few minutes. Now this one is a specialist cuckoo, so a parasite of the bee wolf that I showed you earlier. But what makes this thing remarkable, it has to get into the nest of the bee wolf that I explained a little bit about earlier to lay its own eggs. And its eggs will feed on the larvae of the bee wolf and also the provisions that have been left by the female bee wolf. Okay, so there's quite a lot going on here to sort of get your head around. Now, if this insect, so if this cuckoo gets caught inside the nest of the bee wolf by the bee wolf itself, it's going to be killed. The bee wolf's going to sting it, it's going to kill it. Okay? And so it needs a defense against that. And it turns out actually this thing mimics the odor of the bee wolf. And so the smell of it is exactly the same as a bee wolf. So when it's down in the darkness of this subterranean burrow, the bee wolf doesn't have anything to go on. It can't use its eyesight because it's pitch black. All it has to go on is odor, and it can't smell this thing because it smells the same as itself, as the bee wolf. So this thing can sort of like wander around, sort of as free as a bird in the nest of the host to do some terrible things to the nest of the host by laying its own egg, which then go on to destroy one or a few of the brood chambers. And again, this is the only one that's been well studied. There are lots and lots of examples of this, like chemical mimicry, where things are pretending to be something else, but just based on odor. It's just, this is the only one that's been really well studied to date in this particular interaction, anyway. And then these are probably some of my. I've got a few, like beetles and wasps are my sort of favorite things, but I mean, amongst the beetles, these have to be right up there for me. This is a group of beetles called Stennis. Now, again, in the UK, we've got stacks of these, probably like 72 species in the UK. Often find them in sort of waterside habitats in amongst sort of like tussocky vegetation. They're normally quite small, between like 3 and like maybe 6 millimeters long. But these adult Stennis have an incredible adaptation where if they feel threatened, the ones that live by water anyway, they can step onto the surface of the water, and because they're so tiny, they don't break surface tension. But what they do then is really remarkable, because they emit a special surfactant from their back end here, and that breaks the surface tension behind them, and it propels them forward ridiculously fast, equivalent to a human moving at about 1,000 miles an hour. So they move like a couple of meters in a fraction of a second, which is an enormous speed for a tiny insect. And that allows them to leave their many enemies behind. You know, it gives them the slip. And then things like this. These are you've probably all heard, and probably maybe even seen midges. Now, the larvae of midges often have these wacky and weird pom-poms on their heads and different parts of their body. Again, these are defenses against their predators. These things are produced by little secretory hairs, these big, like, showy pom-poms, this big yellowy thing here with these big balloons. And these come off quite easily. So it's almost like a bit of a distraction from predators. So the predator, other small insects and things, will see this and try and grab these, allowing the midge larvae to escape unharmed. A bit like a lizard when it loses its tail, but on a much smaller and much more interesting scale for me anyway. And then amongst the aphids, aphids, not in this country so much, but aphids have some really incredible defenses. In some aphids, live in colonies in little tiny galls. These are them here. And what happens if a predator comes along and tries to get into the gall and breaks into it, making a hole, these things will commit suicide. So they'll rupture their own bodies. All their sort of hemolymph, so the insect equivalent of blood, comes out and it's very sticky. And it ends up completely sealing the hole. So the gall with all of the other aphids inside is safe. And then yet more aphids are even evolved to become soldiers, where they crawl onto different predators, this lacewing here, and they'll use special horns and other things on their heads that are often venomous to stab the predator, to make it obviously think twice about sort of invading the aphid colony. So you've got all these adaptations to try and keep these insects safe. And again, not many species out there have really been studied in the detail. I've just given you some of the ones that I find really fascinating. The insects have had to evolve some really remarkable ways to get enough energy by eating other things. Often, lots of them, the vast majority of insects are herbivorous, they feed on plants, but then there's obviously a huge number of insects that are predatory too. So in terms of the ones that are herbivores, some of the most fascinating things for me are, this is quite a recent insight actually. This was only discovered a couple of years ago by researchers in Switzerland looking at bumblebees. Now it turns out that bumblebees that emerge early in the year, when there's not many flowers around on the plants, what they can do is they actually injure the plants by stabbing it with their tongue. You can see this bumblebee stabbing the plant here through the leaf. And this damage to the leaf encourages the plants to produce flowers. So effectively engineering their own little habitat to make sure there's plenty of flowers around. So they know, all of that, and that knowledge and what to do is going on in the brain of this animal, that's, barely the size of a sort of pinhead. and it knows how to do that and which plants to do it to, amazingly. And then other examples of very specialist herbivores. I'd imagine you've probably all seen or at least noticed, so galls on different plants. Again, this is a really remarkable way in which insects have adapted to feed on a very specific part of a plant, and also have made the plant sort of do their bidding, really. A gall is really like a creche, really, for their larvae. So when the female, it's normally a wasp that makes some, but it can be other insects like flies and things can also do it. And also non-insects, so things like mites can also make galls on plants. But with the wasps that make things like this here, this is an oak apple. So you might see these at this time of year on oak trees. If you have a close look at these, you can maybe open one. And inside you can see the larvae on the right here and the pupa of these. So these are the offspring of the gall maker. So a female gall wasp came along and used her sting to inject some venom and maybe some other things too that are not well understood at the moment into the growing part of a plant, often a leaf bud, or it can be a sort of developing flower. And whatever's injected into the plant takes over the genetic machinery of the plant to make it produce this structure. The plant would never normally make this. It's got no interest in making this. You know, a plant wants to make leaves and flowers. It doesn't want to make places where insects can live. The gall wasps have evolved to do this, to make a shelter place where their larvae can feed, and also as protection against their predators. So lying in the interior chambers of this gall are lots of nutritious plant cells that the gall wasp larvae will feed on. And because these things are often quite big, it's difficult for different predators to get through to them. But again, you know, where there's a will, there's a way, and lots of insects have evolved to feed specifically on these gall formers by either using a very long egg-laying tube called an ovipositor. They drill down into the host larvae, or they can just chew through them. And then some insects have completely turned the tables on their own predators. So normally we expect vertebrates to feed on insects, but there's a few insects that have completely flipped it. So they feed on much bigger animals. They can feed on vertebrates. So this thing here, this is a genus, belongs to a genus of carabid beetles, so a genus of ground beetles called Hypomis. Hypomis are really unusual because they feed normally as larvae, as they're developing, and also as adults, they can feed on frogs and toads. So what happens is they can wave their back end about, and that mimics like a small grub. Well, they're already like a small grub anyway, but that entices a frog or a toad to come and have a closer look. And then the frog or the toad tries to eat this larva, but they've got some really sharp recurved mandibles, and the frog or toad can't swallow it, and so at the end they try and regurgitate it. In the end, what happens is the beetle larvae ends up consuming this relatively enormous prey. And you do see other examples of this, like you can see sometimes things like dragonflies that will feed on maybe hummingbirds and other things, but it's quite rare because normally insects are normally the prey of vertebrates, but you do have these extraordinary examples where the tables have been turned. And I've showed you these already. These the Stennis road beetles, the ones that can whiz along the surface of water. They've also got, these things have really been blessed in the unique adaptations department because they've also got telescopic mouth parts. So, like a chameleon can shoot at its tongue to catch prey. These things have a much more elaborate structure. It works a bit like an old style sort of car aerial, but it's really quick. So in the blink of an eye, this whole structure here can be shot out to catch prey. So they wander around in sort of like vegetation around maybe bodies of water amongst the grasses and whatever else. And if they see something, they want to catch, maybe on another blade of grass, like maybe an aphid or maybe a mite, this thing can be shot out at lightning speed. And at the end of it, it's got these sticky pads and also these hairs that snag the prey and drag it back to the mandibles where it'll be consumed by the beetle. And again, there's also, I'm only, just illustrating this talk with a few of these examples. There are just so many, there are thousands and thousands, but these are some that have really appealed to me in one way or another. And then animals like this is a type of animal called a bearded lacewing. These things are specialist predators of termites, and they kill They kill their termites, often in small numbers, and maybe 2 or 3, by producing toxic farts. And so they can produce some really nasty gases from their back end that they fire in the direction of termites to knock them out, and they consume them, which is, it sounds pretty grim, but I mean, you know, you have to admit, these are pretty fascinating. You know, if you scale any of these animals up to the size of, you know, a big mammal, you know, they would have attracted so much attention. You know, academics would be like spending their whole careers, you know, just wanting to study these things, but because they're small, they tend to be overlooked. And it's only because like people spend maybe their whole careers, you know, studying these like individual species or maybe a few species that, you know, we're able to learn these things. And then weird feeding, a nice example of weird feeding are some of the moths that moths are normally going to be feeding on things like, you know, nectar. But some of them have adapted to feed on things like fruit as well. So they've evolved proboscis that can break through the sort of the tough rind of fruit. And then these ones again have then adapted to feed on animals, because I've realized that proboscis actually can be used to feed on other things, not just fruit. So this South American species here feeds on the tears of different animals, and it will even make the animal, this is the sleeping bird in Brazil, it will make the animal open its eye so it can get its proboscis inside by sort of tickling its eyelid, so it can slot the proboscis inside to drink up some of the tears. I can see Nikki's face there, she looks disgusted. But remember, don't be disgusted by things. I'm just using these examples to try and show you how deliciously diverse and fascinating the lives of these animals are, okay? And then so we've gone through, like, you know, how these things reproduce and how these different animals, you know, provision food for their offspring and whatever else. I just want to finish off with a few of the interactions, because I've not really touched on some of the really complex interactions between insects and other species. So I want to touch on a few of these here. So insects have struck up all sorts of remarkable relationships with other organisms, often smaller things, sometimes microorganisms, whether it's fungi or bacteria. This beetle here, this is one we have in the UK. This is a thing called a ship timber beetle. So these develop as larvae in the wood of various hardwoods, so often things like birch, sometimes oak. But the female, when she lays eggs, she has a special pouch on her abdomen here that she coats each egg with a few fungal spores. These fungi are actually closely related to, it's like a type of yeast. So the larvae, when they hatch, these carry the yeast with them under the bark of the host tree. And as they're making their little tunnels under the bark, this yeast will widen and growing, and eventually lining the tunnels. Now, it's actually the yeast, the larvae of these things are feeding on. So these things are actually actively farming the fungus. And so they have to make sure the conditions within these tunnels are perfect for the growth of the fungi. So they have to kick out all their dust and feed and frass and all the debris to make sure there's enough air circulation so the yeast can grow. And so in as well as things like leafcutter ants that are well known for farming fungus, a few other insects have exploited other organisms for the purposes of their own nutrition. This one, for example, farms fungi. Now, you've also got some really remarkable interactions between insects and mites. So you can make it here, but what you have here, this little pale cluster. This is a little cluster of mites that are attached to the abdomen of this potter wasp. Now, these mites, which you can see in greater detail on the right-hand side there, that are actually sort of like hunkered down in this little cavity on her abdomen, are actually a sort of sexually transmitted disease. They start off on the male, and during mating, they clamber over onto the female. And they do that because they want to get into the nest that this potter wasp is going to construct. What they do inside the nest isn't well known, but there's something really interesting going on here, because you'll find the brood chambers of the female wasps that they're developing. The female wasp larva consumes all the mites in its own little brood chamber, but the males don't. So when the male leaves its brood chamber, it will be covered with some of these mites on its abdomen. And then when it mates with the female, the mites will clamber over onto the female. And the ins and outs of this interaction are not well known. It was first documented in the 60s, but no one's really studied it since. And so all of these examples here, you know, these hotbeds of research and stuff that people could spend probably whole careers researching to try and find out what's going on. This is another really nice example. of an interaction between two completely unrelated things. So there's a genus of plants in South Africa that produce seeds that smell and look like dung. And they do that because they want to enlist the help of dung beetles to disperse their seeds. So the dung beetle comes along, they think, oh, that smells like some ungulate dung, which is on the bottom right here. It looks like it, smells like it. So the dung beetle rolls it off, buries it underground, and creates perfect conditions for this thing to germinate. So this plant has tapped into the odor cues that this beetle is using to find its normal food, which is ungulate dung. And again, there are lots of examples like this where you've got these complex interactions between completely unrelated things. So yeah, there was just a few examples there to show you some of these amazing interactions. Now, relating back to what Ben was talking about at the start is that, you can go out there, you can contribute in lots of ways. You can contribute by recording where you see these things, where you find these things, to increase what we know about how these insects are distributed, where they live. But there's tons of other questions too. And it doesn't take, like, entomology, I think, is one of probably the most accessible sort of disciplines within science, because you don't really need any specialist gear. You don't really need any specialist equipment. All you really need is just patience and observation. So as I said at the start, there's still millions of species still to discover. In the UK alone, we've got what maybe getting on for 25,000 insect species. And there are new ones still to find in this country. But even with the ones we do have, most of those, their lives are completely unknown, really. You could pick more or less any species at random, and I guarantee there's still a huge amount to find out about it. Questions like, where exactly do they live? How and where do they reproduce? What do they eat? And what eats them? It's these interactions that I find, really fascinating, especially, what other species they're interacting with. And so I'd urge anyone, with even just a sort of casual interest in natural history to spend, a bit more time looking at insects. Just, you don't have to do anything, too active. It can just be like watching stuff, watching what they do. And I guarantee that you'll be absolutely fascinated and hooked. And you can do it, any time of the year, really. Obviously, a lot of these things are going to be more numerous and abundant in the summertime, but you can find things in winter too. And you can often get glimpses and insights into the life cycles of different insects if you look from the winter, because you might find life stages you might not find in the summertime and the spring. So yeah, I mean, obviously I'm biased because I love these animals and I find them endlessly fascinating. But I think if you can go out and just do a little bit of looking, a little bit of observation, you'll be richly rewarded. So that's more or less it from me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ross. Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, you've got to love evolution, right? It's just
yeah.
So the diversity of the species and the behaviours and everything that comes from evolution is amazing. Thank you for that. Would anybody like put any questions in the chat? Now's your chance to do so. I've got a couple as well. To kick us off, I'm just going to put something in the chat as well about Action for Insects, sort of resources and campaigns where people can find out more about insect decline in the UK, what you can do, because obviously, as Ross has said, there's so much to find out about insects. What we don't want to do is lose them before we've, got to find out more about them, discover them, name them, understood them more. And Harriet's put gruesome but also interesting. Yeah, in fact, I didn't find the one about the pteroducts that gruesome. In fact, being tickled on the eyelids didn't sound too bad. I did feel rather sorry for the leafcutter ant queens who were just gonna, have their best time of their life and then they get their head chopped off. But so some things are gruesome, and I totally agree with you, Ross, that if these insects were bigger, it would be a completely different story, wouldn't we? We'd be absolutely fascinated, probably terrified by them. So it's just because they are small. What I think has struck people in the last year or so is with having to slow down, lockdowns and everything, is they've really noticed nature more. They've told us that as well, notice nature in their gardens, in their local green spaces much more. They've had the chance to slow down So I'd really encourage people to carry on doing that. Take some time out to go in your garden, get down on the grass, see what's going on. If you've got ponds,
Yeah.
like we put a lockdown pond in, finally had time to do that, and it's got so many invertebrates now there. Get down and have a close look, and then, as Ben said, record them. We've got a question for you both about which is your favorite insect and why. I'm sure that's going to be a hard one. Ben, you said butterflies and moths. Do you want to elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I just think it's because they're easily accessible, I suppose. Butterflies and moths are easy to identify because, yes, it's great to say submit record, but the insect kingdom is huge. You know, there are so many species, and sometimes you can't identify them down to species level. You're just having to try and get them within a genus or within a family. But butterflies and moths are easy, so everyone can start with them, and they're a good introduction to. That's probably why on our own database that butterflies and moths, well, butterflies particularly, are the most recorded group of insects, because they're easy to find, they're easy to see, they're easy to identify.
Yes.
And I think they're a good starting point.
It's a manageable number of, well, butterflies anyway, so say.
Yeah, only about 58 species, yeah.
There's a manageable number to start with. And Ross, same question to you, your favorite insects and why?
Oh God, yeah, that's such a difficult one. I mean, I think the ones that I showed you the pictures of at the start, so the egg parasitoids, because when you see, I mean, you can see those photographs there, but when you see those things in the flesh, because some of those things are on the cusp of what I can see with the naked eye, but when you see them under a microscope and you see the complexity of these things, these tiny scales, every time it blows my mind. And when you find out a little bit about the way they live, that just makes it even more fascinating, because you're thinking of this tiny thing navigating enormous space out there, whether it's in your garden or wherever else, and doing all the things that I explained earlier, whether it's, you know, searching out the right host, being able to find the right host, searching out, you know, that always blows my mind, those ones. But I mean, there's so many. I love beetles too. I've always loved beetles because they're so cool. And I mean, there's so many of them. I mean, even in the UK, you can go out and regardless of where you go, you will see things you've never seen before amongst the other insects. But I'd agree with Ben that I think things like butterflies and moths are a really good way in, you know, because they're so accessible, because there's not that many species. And so those, for a lot of people, are the sort of entry insects to the dark world of beetles, flies and wasps and things.
Yeah, they'll often be a good entry point, because of course, if you observe butterflies, especially the caterpillars, you'll probably see lots of parasites emerging from the caterpillars. So then you can get into the echinamins and the tachinids and all the rest of the things that prey or parasitize the butterfly. So you're starting off, but then you're opening up this huge world. And
to add to that, Ben, with the start, so with the small cabbage white, when I was talking about that with the intricacies of the way it reproduces, that was only found out fairly recently, and that is a really common butterfly, you know, everywhere.
Yeah.
But it was only by some researchers in the States looking at it, because it was an easy sort of, you know, study species, because it was so easy to get hold of. They found out all these amazing things just because they were looking. And the same goes for any species, you know. It's
not that long, is it, since we found out about the associations with ants between certain species of blue butterfly. You know, it's incredible. We're still learning, and there's it's an amazing world to discover.
And adding to what, you know, Nikki said, I think it's I think this is really valuable too, because it teaches us, you know, just how extraordinary evolution is and some of the things it can produce, you know. Because often when it's taught in schools, I don't think it's often taught very good, you know. It uses some examples that maybe not the best, but if you look at some of these things and the ways that different things have adapted to do and live in different ways, I think, you know, it really sort of, for me, it really sort of pushes it home.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've got a couple more questions have come in. Jude says, Ross, not UK insects, but do you know why cicadas live underground for 17 years?
That is a good question. So that is to do with them avoiding I can't remember the mathematics of it, but there's a very specific thing with that number, because it means that emerging every 17 years, it means their predators are never going to be able to predict when there's going to be a new emergence. Because I don't think it's either 13 years or 17 years. I don't know if it flips, but it's all about predator avoidance, because they emerge on mass, these huge numbers. Yeah, and so that they need to have a good chance, because obviously the predators are going to be alert to this when they do start emerging, but they need to try and reduce that predation pressure as much as possible.
Fascinating. And a question from Sarah: what resources would you recommend for insect identification? I'll throw one in there, Sarah, and they'll take it to Ben and Ross. The Field Study Council guides have some very good sort of laminated fold-out sheets for some of the groups of insects. I've got a few of those, which are really good entry level, and there's some excellent books as well, Collins and other things. Ben or Ross, do you have any additional resources to add?
Yeah, Ben, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I think with butterflies and moths, there's a new book called, it's just come out, British and Irish Moths is a good book, because it's got all the micro moths in it and all the macro moths in it. There are some good keys to some of the difficult insects, but a lot of them you can only identify them by cutting them open and examining their genitalia and things like this. So I think it's best to stick to if you're starting off, I think you stick to the species that do have good guides available. Things like bumblebees, there are good guides for those. Hoverflies, maybe butterflies, moths.
With lice, dragonflies, things like that. And it's worth remembering
there are good field guides to all of these that are available from Bloomsbury and publishers like that, which and Pegasus and good companies that are really good books.
I'll just add, I mean, in terms of like getting interested, I mean, books like this one by Paul Brock, this is quite a good one. It's got a lot of insects in it. I mean, pay attention to when it says comprehensive. These things can never be comprehensive, and I don't know why they ever claim that. But the thing is, it's a very good way of like maybe getting into the more conspicuous things that you will notice. And as you get more into it, you'll start noticing other things, and then you can switch to maybe, because often people like become a specialist in a particular group, identifying a particular group. They'll move from like butterflies and moths and dragonflies into maybe beetles and then wasps and things. In terms of the sort of next level on, these books by these naturalist handbook series, I don't know if you've ever seen it, these are superb. They've often got a key for a particular group of animals in them. This one is solitary wasps, and probably my favorite one. But they've also got loads of ecological information in too. And they also give you ideas on, say if you want to like maybe look at some of these things in detail, the lifestyles, they give you some pointers for how you might do that. And I think that's really valuable. Because as I said before, rather than once you've gone to the point where you can sort of identify stuff and you go out recording, then you might want to sort of dig a bit deeper and try and understand a bit more about the lives of these things. And anyone can make a contribution to that. So these books are a really good starter points for that sort of stuff.
Great. And the book you showed before, the comprehensive one, I've got similar sort of Collins ones. So there are a few like that as well. There's more sort of entry level. And there's some other questions about this is an interesting one from Ian. While exploring my garden last year, I noticed a group of crane fly all bouncing up and down underneath their hanging ornaments. I looked up this behavior. While it seems widely evident, I couldn't find a definite reason for any ideas. Sounds interesting.
That's normally a thing called lecking. So where you have like so flies in particular will sort of focus around something in the landscape. It might be like a high bush or something. And the females and males also. It's all about reproduction. So the males would be doing like flying in a particular way to try and attract females. You often see that with, I don't know if you've ever seen in the winter, so things like winter gnats, you'll see them sort of fly up and down amongst maybe above an ornament in the garden or above a high bush. And it's most things with insects, it's about, trying to reproduce.
Making more insects.
Yeah. Basically.
And it's worth also, when you talk about identification, the different stages of the life cycle that you mentioned a few times. It was only fairly recently I learned what a ladybird larva looked like. Felt quite embarrassed. I was in my 40s before I realised that. And in our work WhatsApp group, somebody posted a video of a ladybird larva coming out of its skin into a new version. So stuff like that you can see on your doorstep, and you can send us videos and pictures and say, what is that? What on earth is going on? And we'll probably send it to Ben to try and tell us the answer. So a couple of questions about the value of things like no mow may and wild verges. Absolutely, we covered this quite a bit in the Dave Goulson talk. If you haven't seen that Dave Goulson talk, it is on our Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust YouTube channel. But yes, allowing places for insects in the different life cycle stages of the insects in any bit of land that you have any control over, so your garden or verges, is really important, definitely. And there's a question about follow-up talk. Could we have a follow-up talk about the relationship of insects to humans and to agriculture, into the wider picture of nature and into relationships with all other species in their lives? Wow, that's a big topic. And climate emergency and survival of the earth. I think we can all agree that insects are crucial to survival of the earth. And there's a big, concern about the abundance of insects going down, as Professor Goulson has highlighted, and other scientists have highlighted in the reports. And Ben mentioned at the beginning about insect splatter on your windscreen, and we know that that's one of the indicators that's gone down over recent years, which is very, very worrying indeed. And leading on from that, Kathy, a question for Ben and Ross: are you hopeful or despairing about the future of insects?
Ben, you go first.
Right, yes. I think we have to be hopeful, don't we? I think the more people that can be engaged to observe and to stop a while and just sit and look at them and start to be fascinated by them, the more hope there is that we'll start to do something about their decline, and encouraging children to do what I did when I was a kid. I used to be always playing about in the soil, or always sort of looking under logs, looking under stones to try and find devil's coach horses or whatever, which is a beetle. I think that a lot of kids have lost that because they spend so much time now just sort of being like their peers and maybe playing on computer games. If we get people interested and get kids interested, there's got to be hope. And I think that we can all play a part in increasing that awareness of insects, and making them a much more widely loved group of animals.
Yeah, well, and of course that's one of the things we do at the Wildlife Trust: get kids out looking at the small stuff. Ross, what's your view about that?
Yeah, well, just to add to that, I mean, I think it's one of the best ways to amuse little kids, because it's free and it's so interesting, because it's endlessly fascinating. If you can get, I'm yet to find a little kid who's not interested in small animals. And insects are the best ones, because you can hold them, but you can't easily handle. Obviously, you'll see birds and like small mammals, but you can't easily handle those things. And I think handling them and picking them up and looking at them closely is the way you sort of get really interested.
Yeah.
But I mean, personally, I'm hopeful. I mean, you think of how long these things have been around for. There's no chance that we could ever drive all of them to extinction. Where in doing what we do at the moment, where all we're doing is making life on Earth less conducive to air survival. Long term, insects will be here, and who knows? In 20 million, 30 million years, the next sort of intelligent race on Earth might be sort of arthropod based rather than anything to do with primates. So yeah. I mean, I'm hopeful. I mean, and I think attitudes are sort of changing, I think. But then it's difficult to know. I think there have been genuine declines. There have been genuine declines in insect abundance and diversity, and you can see that everywhere. Like when I go out and do my work at the moment, doing surveys and things. This year there's a lot less, but that's there's lots of things going on. Obviously, it's the intensification of agriculture, which is really bad, and a race to the bottom in many ways. And then also climate. At the moment this year we've had such an odd year. It was really cold in April, and that's really hammered a lots of things that were just about getting ready to emerge as adults or getting ready to be active again after hibernation. And you had this real cold spell that lasted probably a month. And that's completely hammered a lot of things, because they're at the mercy. These things are at the mercy of whatever's happening to the weather in that particular area at a given time. And if you're going to have these increasingly weird weather events because of climate change, that's obviously going to have a huge impact. But bottom line is I am hopeful.
That's great. Well, it seems like a good topic to end on. I'd just say that they do have their short reproductive life cycles on their side, so it's easy, like Professor Goulson pointed out, it's easier for them to bounce back compared to, say, a population of whales or something, which elephants that take a long time to reproduce, and they don't have so many babies. So and kids as well. I think kids find it easier to study insects because they're also smaller than us, so they're near.
And that's something that people tend. That's something that people tend to forget. They're much closer to the ground, and their eyes are much better.
Yeah, and they notice stuff, and they're not so distracted early on. So get kids while they're young, and don't stop them picking up stuff. It's really good. So thank you so much. Really fascinating. I hope it's inspired some of our people tonight to get out there, just look at the insects. We know that people won't take less likely to take action for wildlife if they're less engaged with it. The more you get engaged, the more you understand it, the more you care about it, the more you like to take action for it. So first thing is to get out there and engage and explore it and just look at stuff and be fascinated by it. And Ross and Ben hopefully have given you some really good hooks from that. We know we've had some kids here tonight, so thank you for that. That's so fascinating. We are going to go a bit bigger with our next talk. In terms of species, we are back to birds actually, and we're going to we've had two or three insect talks, so we're sort of cycling around different topics. Sure, we'll come back. And we've had a big Action for Insects campaign. We've got the insect membership, so we love insects. But we've also got a fascinating talk on the 29th of July by Edward Mayer from Swift Conservation, which I've just put the link in there. And I think that will also be in the follow-up email that you get. So, and if you've got any follow-on questions about insects, do send them to us at mail@wildsheffield.com, or if you're not from Sheffield, contact your local wildlife trust and join them and get involved. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and that's goodbye from all of us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.